The story of ancient Egypt is one of long rivers, golden sands, and a civilization that endured for thousands of years, shaping the lives of kings, queens, scribes, priests, merchants, and farmers alike. Yet behind the grandeur of pyramids and the solemnity of temples, there existed the quieter, less celebrated world of royal courts, where influence was woven not only through politics and power, but also through subtler forms of charm, ritual, ceremony, and the delicate art of presence. The courts of Egypt, particularly in the periods of prosperity, when pharaohs commanded wealth and prestige, were places where seduction was not always of the flesh, but often of the mind, of the senses, and of the imagination. They were spaces where one's clothing, perfumes, jewels, and gestures could speak louder than proclamations or swords. To understand these courts, one must first place them within the geography of the Nile, for the Nile was not only the lifeblood of Egypt's agriculture, it was also the stage upon which much of its courtly life unfolded. From the palaces along the riverbanks to the ceremonial barges that glided across the waters, the river linked together cities and temples, carried officials and envoys, and provided the scenery against which Egyptian royalty performed their majesty. The palace was not only a residence, but also a theatre of appearances. There, day after day, courtiers gathered in carefully arranged order, awaiting the presence of the pharaoh or the royal family. Every detail mattered: the rhythm of rituals, the fragrance of incense, the gleam of polished stone floors, and the carefully prepared garments that announced status and wealth. One must imagine the spaces of these courts. They were vast, often designed to impress. High walls enclosed gardens where papyrus and lotus bloomed. Pools, lined with tiles of blue and green, reflected the sunlight and at night shimmered beneath torches. Within the halls, columns soared like trees, their capitals carved with palm leaves or lotus buds. The walls were adorned with painted reliefs depicting gods, victories, and symbols of fertility, always meant to remind the visitor of the divine nature of kingship. Yet within this framework of power, there lay subtle currents of seduction. The women of the court, whether queens, consorts, or ladies in waiting, learned the arts of grace and charm. Perfume was not simply a luxury, it was a language. Small cones of scented wax were worn upon the head, slowly melting in the heat, releasing fragrances of myrrh, frankincense, or lotus throughout the evening. Jewelry too was more than ornament. A necklace of faience beads, a golden amulet, or a finely crafted bracelet might serve as a talisman, a sign of protection, or a declaration of status. The choice of linen, sheer and whitened in the sun, clinging to the body in folds, gave an air of elegance that caught the eye and lingered in memory. The court was an environment where presence itself was performance. In these courts, the pharaoh was the sun around which all revolved. To be near him was to bask in reflected glory. Yet access was limited and carefully controlled. Envoys, ambassadors, and noble visitors often had to wait for hours, sometimes days, rehearsing their words and preparing their gifts. Gifts themselves were part of this dance of seduction. Exotic animals, jars of fragrant oils, finely woven cloths, and treasures from distant lands were offered not only as tribute, but as tokens meant to win favor. The court became a place where exchange was ceremonial and where every gesture carried meaning. Priests too had their part, for in Egypt, no division existed between the sacred and the political. Temples and palaces were linked, and rituals affirmed the divine legitimacy of the ruler. Incantations, hymns, and offerings were part of the daily rhythm. Yet within the dimly lit sanctuaries and the incense-filled halls, the power of sound, scent, and spectacle was used to impress, to sway, and to hold attention. Seduction here was not of passion, but of reverence. The people were drawn into a vision of cosmic order, in which the pharaoh, as the living Horus, guaranteed stability and fertility. One might imagine the court of Akhenaten, where new forms of worship brought the Aten, the sun disk, into prominence. The art of the time depicted elongated figures, tender embraces, and rays of sunlight ending in small hands that touched the royal family. This was a court where imagery itself became seductive, inviting all to perceive intimacy between humans and the divine. Later, under Nefertiti, one of the most renowned queens, beauty and presence were elevated to almost mythic proportions. Her visage, preserved in sculpture, remains among the most recognized symbols of elegance in the ancient world. Her court, too, must have been one where appearances were orchestrated with care, and where her presence alone conveyed power as effectively as any decree. Throughout Egyptian history, feasts at the courts provided further occasions for display. Banquets were not only opportunities for indulgence, but also stages for the art of subtle influence. Musicians played harps and flutes, dancers performed with slow, deliberate movements, and wine flowed into cups. Lotus flowers were handed to guests to hold, inhale, and sometimes wear. Guests reclined, surrounded by scents, sounds, and colors, in an atmosphere that blurred the boundary between leisure and politics. To attend such a feast was to be reminded of one's place in the order of things, yet also to experience the charm of refinement that the court projected. These courts were not only Egyptian but international. Foreign princesses were sent as brides, arriving with entourages and customs of their own. Letters preserved in the Amarna tablets reveal negotiations, exchanges of gifts, and the delicate dance of alliance through marriage. Here too seduction was at play, though not always physical. It was the seduction of diplomacy, of presenting one's land as wealthy, one's gods as powerful, one's daughters as worthy consorts. The court became a crossroads of cultures, and in its halls were heard many tongues, each weaving stories and promises. Even in death, seduction lingered. Tomb paintings of nobles show them banqueting in eternity, surrounded by musicians and adorned with fine clothing and jewelry. The courtly life was imagined to continue beyond the grave, a promise of everlasting elegance and joy. What one experienced in the palaces of life was meant to be replicated in the halls of Osiris, where offerings of bread, beer, and perfume would sustain the spirit. Thus the court was both earthly and eternal, a mirror of the divine order and a rehearsal for the afterlife. The power of the Egyptian courts lay not only in the decrees they issued, but in the impressions they created. To step into their presence was to be enveloped by architecture, fragrance, clothing, sound, and ritual, all carefully orchestrated. It was to be seduced by an atmosphere that blended awe with allure, making obedience seem natural and admiration inevitable. This was a form of power more subtle than armies, yet perhaps more enduring, for it shaped the imagination of all who entered. When one thinks today of ancient Egypt, one remembers not only its monuments but also its aura, the sense of timeless refinement that clings to its memory. This aura was carefully cultivated in the courts, where every act was both political and aesthetic, where charm served authority, and where seduction was woven into the very fabric of rule. In the slow, unfolding rhythm of Egyptian time, where centuries drifted like the Nile's waters and dynasties rose and fell as predictably as the flood, the courts of Egypt continued their steady life. Within their walls, rulers reigned and courtiers moved in carefully orchestrated harmony. Life here was not hurried, but deliberate, each act flowing into the next, bound by ceremony, by tradition, and by the weight of appearances. If the pyramids were built to last for eternity, then the daily rituals of the court were designed to preserve power in the present. To imagine a day in the court of Egypt is to imagine a day structured by routine, yet filled with subtle allure. At dawn, the first light fell upon the horizon, casting long beams over the Nile and into the palace courtyards. Birds stirred in the gardens, and priests began their morning hymns. The pharaoh, regarded as the living embodiment of divine order, would rise and prepare for appearance. His attendants washed him with scented water, oils of cedar or lotus rubbed into his skin. and garments of fresh linen laid carefully upon his body. Jewelry of gold and lapis lazuli was placed upon his chest and arms, each piece not simply decorative but a symbol of cosmic balance. By the time he entered the audience hall, he was not merely a man, but a manifestation of divinity. Wrapped in the aura of ceremony, the courtiers had already assembled. They stood in arranged ranks, their positions determined by hierarchy and favor. Each knew his place, each knew how to bow, how to speak, how to keep his gaze lowered at the right moment. Their garments too told stories. The higher the rank, the finer the weave of linen, the more elaborate the jewelry. Some carried scrolls, some carried gifts, some stood simply to be present. And in this atmosphere, silence itself was a form of reverence. For presence in the court was a privilege, and access to the ruler was itself a form of wealth. The pharaoh would receive petitions, hear reports from generals, and acknowledge offerings from foreign envoys. Each act was punctuated by ritual. Priests burned incense as hymns were chanted, filling the air with fragrance. Musicians played softly in the background, harps and flutes weaving melodies that seemed to echo the rhythm of eternity. This blending of politics, religion, and art was not accidental. It was the court's way of seducing all who entered, of enveloping them in an atmosphere where power felt natural and inevitable. As the day moved forward, the palace halls became stages of subtle persuasion. Foreign emissaries entered bearing tribute, vases of alabaster, jars of fragrant oils, gold from Nubia, lapis lazuli from distant mountains, and exotic animals brought across deserts. Each gift was displayed with care, and courtiers watched closely, for such offerings were not only tokens of loyalty, but instruments of influence. The emissary who brought the most pleasing tribute might leave with more than gratitude. He might leave with a treaty, an alliance, or a marriage arrangement. Marriage itself was a key part of courtly life. The seductive charm of the Egyptian court was often extended across borders through royal brides. These women arrived with their entourages, bringing with them new clothing styles, new perfumes, new songs, and sometimes even new gods. Yet they too were absorbed into the Egyptian order, learning to wear linen of sheer whiteness, to adorn themselves with jewelry shaped in the sacred motifs of lotus and papyrus, and to walk slowly through the halls with the same deliberate grace as Egyptian queens. In these women, politics and seduction intertwined, for their beauty and presence became instruments of diplomacy. Banquets, held in the evenings, were another stage of courtly seduction. Courtyards and banquet halls were lit with torches, their light flickering upon painted walls. Guests reclined upon low couches. Servants moved silently with trays of bread, meat, fruits, and wine. Musicians performed. Dancers moved with slow gestures, their bodies wrapped in flowing linen, their hair perfumed and braided. Guests held lotus flowers, inhaling their scent, a symbol of rebirth and beauty. The atmosphere was one of calm indulgence, a blending of pleasure and ritual. Yet beneath the music and fragrance, politics continued. Words were exchanged, alliances whispered, promises hinted at, all under the veil of enjoyment. Perfume itself was a language of the court. Egyptians perfected the art of fragrance, blending resins, flowers, and oils into scents that lingered on the skin and in the air. A guest entering a room might be remembered not by his words, but by the trail of fragrance that followed him. For queens and noble women, perfume was almost a signature, a way of announcing presence before a word was spoken. In this sense, the courts of Egypt were seductive, not because of open passions, but because of carefully cultivated atmospheres, where sight, sound, and scent worked together to create impressions that endured. The gardens of the palace were yet another extension of this charm. Pools lined with blue tiles reflected the sky, papyrus and lotus grew in abundance, and birds imported from foreign lands added exotic sound. These gardens were not wild but carefully ordered, symbols of control over nature. Walking in them with the pharaoh or the queen was an honor. To be invited into such private spaces was to be reminded of one's closeness to the heart of power. In the stillness of the garden, where water reflected torchlight at night, and the air carried the scent of lotus blossoms, conversations carried meanings beyond their words. Priests too played their part in sustaining this seductive courtly atmosphere. In the temples linked to the palace, they performed rituals that reinforced the divine role of the ruler. Sacred statues were washed and perfumed daily, offerings of bread, beer, and incense made to the gods, hymns sung in steady cadence. Visitors and courtiers witnessed these rituals and were reminded that the pharaoh was not only a king, but a mediator between the mortal and the divine. To resist his authority was to resist the gods themselves. Thus religion, too, became part of the court's power of seduction. One cannot overlook the role of imagery. Walls of palaces and tombs were covered with reliefs, showing the ruler, in idealized form, smiting enemies, offering to gods, embracing queens, and receiving tribute. These images were more than decoration. They were propaganda, designed to seduce the viewer into believing in eternal order. Even in private chambers, painted scenes of banquets and musicians surrounded the courtiers, as if to remind them that courtly life was itself eternal. The court was not only lived but imagined, and its imagery reinforced its allure. As centuries passed, different dynasties shaped the courts in their own ways, yet the same themes endured. Under Hatshepsut, a queen who reigned as king, the court was transformed into a space where female authority was cloaked in the same rituals of majesty as her male predecessors. Under Akhenaten and Nefertiti, the court became a place of intimacy with the divine, where art showed tenderness and rays of the sun disk reached down to bless the royal family. Under Ramses II, the court expanded into a theater of grandeur, where victories were celebrated with monumental displays and feasts of unmatched scale. Yet in each case, seduction remained at the heart of courtly life, whether in the charm of beauty, the allure of ritual, or the atmosphere of magnificence. As night fell upon the Egyptian court, the halls quieted, torches burned low, and silence returned. Yet even in silence, the impression of the day lingered, the scent of incense in the air, the gleam of gold upon statues, the memory of music still echoing in the ears. For those who left the court, the experience was not easily forgotten. They carried with them a vision of Egypt as a land of order, beauty, and majesty, a land where power was gentle yet irresistible, where seduction was subtle yet enduring. In this way, the courts of Egypt lasted not merely as political institutions, but as cultural performances, shaping how Egypt was perceived both by its own people and by distant lands. They endured not only in records and ruins, but in memory, in imagination, and in the stories whispered through time. And it is perhaps this enduring charm, this timeless seduction, that explains why, even today, the thought of ancient Egypt conjures not only pyramids and temples, but also the image of elegant courts filled with fragrance, music, and majesty. The courts of ancient Egypt were never merely centers of administration. They were entire worlds, carefully constructed and endlessly maintained. Places where order and beauty intertwined to sustain the illusion of eternity. To understand them is to step into a rhythm of life unlike any other, a rhythm shaped by ritual, fragrance, music, and ceremony. Within these halls, seduction was not fleeting passion, but an enduring atmosphere, crafted with care to remind all who entered of majesty and permanence. At dawn, the palace stirred with deliberate movement. Servants began their duties long before the courtiers gathered. The first task was always purification. Floors of polished stone were swept clean, pools skimmed, and incense burned to cleanse the air. Even silence was curated, broken only by the faint call of birds in the palace gardens or the soft sound of water trickling from fountains. Slowly, the vast palace became ready for its daily performance, a stage upon which king, queen, and courtiers would enact the drama of majesty. The pharaoh's appearance was the axis around which this drama turned. His attendants dressed him not as one would dress a man, but as one would clothe a god. Linen, whitened until it gleamed, was folded into precise pleats and draped over his body. Gold jewelry, broad collars, heavy bracelets, and protective amulets was arranged with ritual precision. Perfumed oils blended from myrrh, lotus, and frankincense were rubbed into his skin until his very presence became a cloud of fragrance. By the time he emerged, he was no longer an individual, but a symbol of divine order, the living embodiment of Horus on earth. Courtiers waited for hours for these moments. They stood in arranged rows in the audience hall, their linen robes pressed and their jewelry carefully displayed. Each man and woman present had studied the rules of approach: when to bow, when to kneel, when to speak, when to remain silent. The court was not a place for spontaneity. Every gesture mattered. Every glance could shape favor or disgrace. To fail in the smallest detail could mean exclusion, and exclusion from the court meant exclusion from power. Yet within this strict order lay the essence of seduction. The court's power was not only in its decrees, but in its atmosphere. To stand in the hall, surrounded by towering columns painted in vibrant colors, to hear the steady rhythm of hymns sung by priests, to smell the heavy sweetness of incense drifting through the air. This was to be overwhelmed not by force but by presence. The court seduced the senses, drawing all into its orbit, making obedience feel natural and inevitable. Foreign envoys knew this well. They arrived from distant lands bearing gifts: ivory from Africa, cedar from Lebanon, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, and silver from Anatolia. Each gift was carried into the palace with ceremony, placed before the throne, and described by interpreters. But more than the gifts themselves, the envoys carried stories. Stories of their own rulers, their own lands, their own gods. These stories were meant to charm, to persuade, to flatter. Yet more often than not, it was the envoys themselves who were seduced. For the Egyptian court, with its glittering halls, perfumed queens, and golden images of gods, was unlike anything they had seen before. They returned home not only with treaties but with awe, carrying tales of Egypt's majesty that would echo across borders. Marriage, too, was diplomacy performed as seduction. Princesses from foreign lands entered Egypt as brides, bringing with them customs and treasures. They arrived adorned in silks, with hair braided in foreign styles, their attendants carrying chests of gold and fabrics. Yet once inside the Egyptian court, they were absorbed into its order. They learned to wear linen whitened in the sun, to anoint themselves with lotus oil, to move with slow grace through the palace gardens. In this blending of foreign charm and Egyptian ritual, the court displayed its power to absorb, to transform, to seduce not only individuals, but entire nations. Evenings in the court belonged to feasts. Banquet halls came alive with torchlight reflecting off painted walls and polished floors. Guests reclined on low couches, their heads adorned with cones of perfumed wax that melted slowly, releasing fragrance throughout the night. Servants moved quietly, carrying trays of bread, roasted meats, fruits, and jars of wine. Musicians played harps, flutes, and lutes, their melodies weaving through the hall in gentle rhythms. Dancers moved slowly, their linen garments flowing, their arms tracing elegant gestures that seemed to echo the movements of the Nile itself. Guests held lotus flowers, inhaling their sweet scent, symbols of beauty and rebirth. Yet even in this atmosphere of pleasure, politics persisted. A glance across the hall, a whispered exchange, the seating arrangement itself, all carried meaning. Who reclined near the pharaoh who sat further away? Who received an extra cup of wine? These details were not overlooked. Banquets were stages where seduction was subtle, where favor was granted not in words but in gestures, where alliances were hinted at with a smile, or sealed with the sharing of food. Perfume was another language of the court. Egyptians perfected the art of blending oils and resins into fragrances that could linger for hours. Each queen had her preferred scent, each priest his sacred blend. To enter a room filled with myrrh was to step into sanctity. To pass a woman perfumed with lotus was to feel allure. The court was a place where fragrance itself carried power, where the memory of a scent could sway hearts long after words were forgotten. Jewelry, too, held meaning beyond beauty. Amulets shaped as scarabs promised rebirth. Eyes of Horus offered protection. Ankhs carried the power of life. A golden collar was not only decoration, but a statement of authority. In the palace halls, jewelry gleamed in torchlight, catching the eye, reminding all of the wealth and favor of those who wore it. In this way, even silent adornment became a form of seduction, drawing attention, commanding respect. The palace gardens were quieter, but no less powerful in their charm. Pools lined with blue tiles reflected torchlight at night, while lotus blossoms floated gently on their surface. Papyrus reeds swayed, and exotic birds called from branches of imported trees. To walk in these gardens with the pharaoh or queen was a privilege few enjoyed. Here, conversations carried meanings too delicate for public halls. Here, promises were whispered, alliances hinted at, affections shown in gestures too subtle for the eyes of the court. The garden was a place of private seduction, where power softened into intimacy. The priests, meanwhile, maintained the divine aura of the court. In temples linked to the palace, they performed rituals from dawn until night. Statues of gods were washed, clothed, perfumed, and offered bread and beer. Hymns were sung in steady cadence, incense rose in curling smoke, lamps flickered against sacred walls. The presence of these rituals within earshot of the palace reminded all that the pharaoh's power was not his alone, but sanctioned by the gods. To resist him was to resist cosmic order itself. The court thus seduced not only the senses but the spirit, binding loyalty not only with beauty but with faith. As night deepened, the palace grew still. Torches dimmed, musicians fell silent, and servants cleared away the remains of the banquet. Courtiers withdrew to their chambers, foreign guests retired, and silence once more filled the halls. Yet the atmosphere lingered. The fragrance of incense clung to the air. The gleam of gold remained in memory. The sound of harps echoed faintly in the mind. For those who had witnessed the court that day, the experience would not easily fade. They carried with them an impression of majesty, of beauty, of order, an impression that would shape their loyalties and their stories. The seductive courts of ancient Egypt were not places of chance but of design. Every ritual, every object, every sound and scent was carefully chosen. The court was a tapestry, woven not with threads but with experiences. And in that tapestry, power and charm were inseparable. It was not enough for Egypt to command armies, it commanded imagination. It was not enough for pharaohs to issue decrees, they inspired awe. This was the true strength of the court, not merely in ruling bodies, but in ruling minds. Centuries later, when Egypt's monuments still rose above the sands, travelers from distant lands would stand before them in wonder. They would speak of pyramids, temples, and statues. But those who had once entered the courts would remember something more. The fragrance, the music, the slow elegance of gestures, the allure of queens and the solemnity of priests. They would remember the atmosphere, that invisible but undeniable force that made Egypt feel eternal. And perhaps it is this, above all else, that explains the lasting fascination with ancient Egypt. For long after its rulers fell and its palaces crumbled, the memory of its courts endured, not in stone alone, but in imagination. The seductive courts of Egypt were not only lived, they were dreamed, and they continue to be dreamed still, carried forward in history's slow current, like the Nile itself, eternal and unending. Imagine, if you will, the palace halls of ancient Egypt in the later centuries of the New Kingdom, a world where the desert sun shone so fiercely upon the land that the coolness of the court's interior became a world apart, a sanctuary filled with both political maneuverings and indulgent delights. The courts of Egypt were not simply places of judgment or administrative order. They were living theaters of ritual, spectacle, intrigue, and endless ceremony. The throne room itself, with its gilded pillars carved into the shape of papyrus stems, was less a chamber of government than an arena of majesty designed to impress all who entered with the weight of history. The burden of divine kingship and the seductive aura of absolute power. To walk within these courts was to encounter a rhythm, unlike the ordinary streets of Memphis or Thebes. Servants moved slowly, carefully, each step rehearsed and choreographed, as if they too played a part in some grand drama. Perfume of lotus oil and incense drifted constantly through the halls, dulling the senses and lulling the visitor into a state of hushed reverence. It was no accident that the courts felt hypnotic. The kings and queens of Egypt understood deeply the role of atmosphere in maintaining authority. To be within the palace was to enter another reality, one in which mortals moved in the shadow of gods. At the very center of this world was the pharaoh, seated upon a throne inlaid with gold, silver, lapis lazuli, and carved ivory. Yet even as one might think of the pharaoh as the sole figure of authority, the reality of the court was far more complicated. Around him moved an endless circle of courtiers, priests, scribes, guards, entertainers, and concubines. Each had their place, their duties, their ambitions. The court was not only a mirror of the king's majesty, but also a restless machine, fueled by intrigue, whispers, favors, and subtle rivalries. Those who entered its world were inevitably seduced, not only by its splendor, but by the possibility of power hidden beneath every smile and gesture. Consider the scribes, for instance. They were the keepers of words, the guardians of memory. Sitting cross-legged with reed pens in hand and papyrus stretched before them, they recorded every decree, every feast, every audience with foreign envoys. Their hands were calloused, their eyes trained to notice every detail. Without them, nothing of the court's glory would endure. Yet even they were caught up in its seductions, for a scribe could rise or fall, depending on how carefully he worded a decree or how faithfully he recorded the pharaoh's words. A misplaced phrase could mean disgrace. A carefully crafted report could bring promotion and favor. The quiet scratching of their pens was as much a part of court politics as the dazzling banquets or the solemn rituals. The banquets themselves revealed another side of courtly life. Reclining on low couches, noblemen and noblewomen were served with golden cups of wine imported from distant lands, bowls of figs and dates, roasted meats flavored with honey and herbs, and fresh bread still warm from the ovens. Music filled the air, harps, flutes, and drums combining in hypnotic rhythms that seemed designed to soothe the mind into a soft haze. Dancers moved gracefully between the tables, their movements slow, deliberate, their sheer linen garments fluttering lightly as golden anklets chimed with each step. Guests inhaled deeply the scent of burning myrrh, a fragrance associated with both pleasure and sanctity. One might imagine that feasting in such a setting would be mere indulgence, but in truth it was also politics. Who sat closest to the pharaoh? Whose goblet was refilled most often? Who received a smile, a word, or even a glance from the queen? Every small gesture was a signal. Every seat at the table a silent measure of power. The queens of Egypt, too, played a central role in the seductive aura of the courts. Draped in finely woven linen that shimmered in the lamplight, adorned with collars of turquoise and gold, they moved with practiced grace. To outsiders, their beauty seemed the essence of Egyptian elegance, but behind each gesture lay careful calculation. The queen was not merely a consort, she was a symbol of fertility, prosperity, and divine legitimacy. Her presence affirmed the stability of rule, and her influence within the palace could be profound. She granted audiences, offered intercessions, and in some cases wielded political power equal to that of the pharaoh himself. Her allure was as much about wisdom and authority as it was about physical beauty. Then there were the priests, guardians of temples, interpreters of divine will, and constant figures at court. They arrived robed in fine linen, leopard skins draped over their shoulders, incense burners in their hands, chanting prayers as they approached the throne. Their authority was not of the sword but of the spirit, yet it was no less powerful. To dismiss the council of the priests was to risk angering the gods themselves. Their rituals brought sacred legitimacy to the pharaoh's rule, and their ceremonies filled the palace with a sense of divine presence. But they too were part of the seductive machinery of the court. Their voices soothed, their chants mesmerized, their slow movements wrapped the court in a veil of ritual mystery. Visitors to the court were quickly enveloped in this atmosphere. Imagine a foreign envoy arriving, bearing gifts from lands far away, silver from the Levant, cedar wood from Lebanon, ivory from Nubia, exotic animals from distant deserts. To step into the palace was to be overwhelmed by its splendor, the towering pylons, painted with scenes of gods and kings, the cool stone floors polished by countless feet, the columns carved into lotus and papyrus forms, their painted colors vivid even in the dim lamplight. The envoy would be led into the throne room, his heart pounding, as musicians played softly and servants burned incense to perfume the air. By the time he reached the pharaoh, he would already be half subdued by the hypnotic majesty of the place. The court itself seduced as effectively as any negotiation. But not all seductions were so grand. Much of the court's life unfolded in smaller, quieter chambers. The harem, for instance, was both a private world of intimacy and a political institution. The women of the harem were carefully chosen, some daughters of nobles, others gifts from foreign rulers, still others selected for their beauty and grace. They were perfumed, adorned with jewels, trained in music, dance, and conversation. To many, this world might seem the pinnacle of luxury, but it was also a place of competition, jealousy, and danger. To rise in the harem meant security and influence. To fall meant exile into obscurity. Within those perfumed chambers, alliances were forged, secrets exchanged, and sometimes plots conceived. Even here, the seduction of power shaped every interaction. The guards of the palace, standing tall with spears in hand, seemed the opposite of seduction. Yet they too contributed to the atmosphere, their silence, their watchful eyes, their disciplined stillness, all reminded those within that beneath the soft music and flowing wine lay a hard core of authority. The palace was a place of indulgence, yes, but also of control. To linger too long in its pleasures was to forget that one's fate depended on the favor of the throne. The seductive courts of Egypt charmed, but they also bound, holding each participant within a net of expectation and duty. Over time, one could say, the courts of Egypt became their own kind of dream. Those who lived within them, scribes, priests, dancers, queens, guards, envoys, became accustomed to the rhythms of incense and music, of banquets and rituals. To leave the palace and step into the ordinary streets of the city must have felt like waking from a dream. The air suddenly harsher, the sounds louder, the world less forgiving. And yet, for those who had tasted the life of the court, its memory lingered always, like the echo of distant music or the faint trace of perfume carried on the wind. And so, the seductive courts of ancient Egypt remind us that history is not only about battles and laws, but about the slower, quieter ways in which power is maintained through ritual, spectacle, atmosphere, and allure. In their halls, one finds not merely rulers and decrees, but the deep human desire to be awed, to be soothed, to be entranced. It is a history not of noise, but of whispers, not of commands, but of gestures. And it is perhaps this quality that makes them so enduring in memory, for even now, thousands of years later, one can still close one's eyes and imagine the soft music, the glow of torchlight, the scent of incense, and the slow unfolding of life within the seductive courts of ancient Egypt.